Hello. So this week we are going to cover just some of the basics of skills of communication, focused on face-to-face communication. So this is not meant to be a totally exhaustive or comprehensive overview. It's mostly just an introduction. As it stands right now, your assignments are sort of compact over a few to they're kind of compact in the sense that over the last few weeks I've just bundled them all together. So I'm not going to add a lot of assignments this week, and you'll have your community resource reflection due soon anyhow, so I'll leave it at that basically. But I do want to set some markers out for what will eventually be topics we dive into a little more depth with. And the first, something we've covered already a little bit, which is attachment. And I just wanted to recap a little bit of what attachment theory points to, and specifically how it relates to what we call secure attachment. So there are four attachment styles or categories: the secure, avoidant, ambivalent, and disorganized or disoriented. And so when we're aiming toward secure attachment, there are some ways that we as professionals who work with young children, but also as caregivers of young children, can do our best to ensure that the child or children have their best chance at becoming securely attached. And the 5 ways to foster secure attachment that I'm reviewing here include collaborative communication, or contingent communication is another way of it's sometimes put, which basically means to remain attuned or tuned into the apparent inner world of the child and respond according to that, through the quality and timing of your own verbal and nonverbal signals. And those we'll talk a little bit more about this through this presentation with verbal and nonverbals. But collaborative communication implies that it's a team effort, right? I, the adult or the professional, the caregiver, whatever, are doing my best to be attuned to the child's inner emotional and mental states. And I'm responding to those states, not simply to what the child does or what the child says, but to what I make as a best guess. That's basically what it is, at the child's inner state. So part of what can be helpful in building collaborative dialogue is also something that will be helpful for children to learn how to regulate their inner states, is the second aspect of fostering secure attachment, which is reflective dialogue. This is just using language in a way that attempts to make sense of and then verbally describe or identify the child's inner experience. And it's helpful for the adult because they learn a little bit more about the child, what the child is experiencing, and the child can kind of help them fine-tune that. But more importantly, it's a way that allows a child to grow to understand themselves more deeply. It's as though you're saying to the child, an example of what reflective dialogue might sound like would be if you were to say something like, you sound like you feel ignored, if you were to say that to a child, or you seem to feel sad about something. Saying things like that allows the child to hear a kind of guess at what their inner state is, so that they can go, maybe that is how I feel, or maybe that is a way that I could describe what's happening to me right now. Helps them make sense of their own states of mind so that they can then describe it to others and regulate it themselves. A part of an overlapping aspect is the third thing listed here, which is emotional communication. And this is a little more self-directed when the adult, caregiver, or professional gives the child emotional language to work with by describing their own inner states. Sort of like demonstrating how to describe emotion by doing so yourself. And that's maybe not always appropriate to totally describe your inner state as the adult, but that's what emotional communication is for. Fourthly, a coherent shared narrative is a major part of what apparently of the ingredients that lead to secure attachment. And so the coherent aspect of this is kind of like an ongoing and connected stream. And a shared narrative means that the way that I view the story of my life in some way overlaps or connects to the child's. And this is more specifically geared toward the family, of course, because the family has their own kind of story, their own history. And that's what narrative is. It's just a story or an understanding of a history. But as professionals, we can have this with children too, as we can describe or participate in a shared narrative of the school environment, of the community history, and things like that. Now, lastly, is an interesting, maybe overlooked sometimes, aspect of secure attachment, which is repair. I like this, the fact that this is pointed to, because it acknowledges the fact that in any relationship there will be what we could call ruptures, where things don't go well. We, the adults, don't handle ourselves well. The children or child find themselves having a hard time regulating their own emotions, and that will happen. When that rupture occurs, repair is a way that we can revisit what happened and allow it to actually become something healing instead of just a mistake or just a negative experience. It's also as a way of teaching children how to revisit their own mistakes or handle conflict in a mature and appropriate way. So those are 5 things that we can actually bring to our interactions with children. We can also do it with, bring these things to our everyday interactions with other adults as well. But it's something to keep in mind. Now, as we move to more specific talk about communication skills, a couple of things that I want to mention that are pretty important. Firstly, communication as an idea, as a concept, is not something we really fully understand. There's a lot of good ideas about it, and a lot of research that supports certain ideas about communication. But the way that human beings communicate with one another is not fully mapped out in exactly a complete way. And part of what makes that evident is the fact that we are always communicating. We cannot not communicate. And because of that, it's kind of the steady stream nature of communication makes it a little bit hard to define. But there are some ways that we can talk about it. And a couple of ways that I think are useful are what I'm kind of calling the explanatory way of approaching communication and the intentional way of approaching communication. What I mean by these two things is that the explanatory way is sort of backing out and pointing to and describing different ways of communicating. Intentional is a little pointing toward the way that I use it myself. It's a way of understanding it from a third person versus a first person is another way of thinking about it. So we're going to go over 3 models of communication and describe them in the explanatory and intentional ways. So linear communication is what could be called communication as action. This is the way that speeches are set up. For instance, when someone's making a speech, generally they are using it as an arrow. They're pointing toward the audience, using their communication to deliver something as an action. And it's not a back and forth, it's a one-way signal, and it's could be thought of as kind of an oversimplified way of understanding what communication actually is. It's assuming that the message I give as the speaker is exactly understood by the listener, and it's understood in the same way that I understand it. So it's generally kind of a oversimplified way of viewing communication. Circular communication, on the other hand, is considered communication as interaction. It's a two-way signal happening. I'm delivering to you, you're delivering to me as the speaker and listener, and have those roles shift. And there's always feedback going on. The way that we understand how circular communication works is through feedback loops. I'm giving you some information, you're processing it, you're giving me information, I'm processing it, and that circular motion continues. And there is a kind of implicit effort to understand the other with more clarity and to process what you understand about that individual or that audience or that other speaker. Now, there's also a way of thinking about communication that we might call nonlinear. And this way of understanding communication could be thought of as communication as transaction. So rather than as action or interaction, this is communication as transaction. And what it kind of points to is the idea that when we are in a formal setting of communication, there's a lot more happening than we could ever really put our finger on or understand. And the complexity of the interaction is really highlighted. So not only am I sharing information with you, you're processing it, sharing it with me, I'm processing it, but all of my history and understanding and context of life and all of your history and context and understanding of life sort of filter what our process, that whole process. So all that I hear and see from you is filtered through my own way of seeing the world in general. And that has more of a kind of ripple out effect than simply a circular motion. Using this idea of communication as transaction intentionally kind of points to a couple of things. One being that we must be very careful to pay subtle attention to all that's happening around us and within ourselves. But it also allows us to maintain a kind of humility that we won't fully understand what's happening around us or even within ourselves. And coming from that not knowing position and understanding that there's always more to the story is something that can actually really aid communication. There's always a little bit of an openness to receive more newness. So that's a kind of an important part of what that nonlinear idea might point to. Okay, so when we are in a situation of face-to-face communication, and that's what we're really highlighting today, there are different ways to communicate through written, phone, text, email, stuff like that. But today we're highlighting face-to-face. So it could be useful to think of face-to-face communication as being a combination of linguistic and non-linguistic expression. Other ways of putting it, I think the way your text puts it is symbolic or non-symbolic. You also might think of it as verbal or non-verbal communication. So when we describe linguistic, symbolic, or verbal, we're talking about speech, like the actual words that we choose, the words that we write. Other sign language is an example of that too. And underneath and kind of supporting all that, we have what we might call non-linguistic or non-symbolic or non-verbal. And that includes eye contact, facial expression, tone of voice, posture, gestures, timing, and intensity. Those are a good list of some non-verbals, and you can kind of remember them in the way that you, if you were to do this, eye contact, facial expression, tone of voice, posture, gestures, timing, and intensity. those are really good ways to kind of scan your own nonverbals and what they might, the person you're speaking with might be picking up from you. And it's also a good way to kind of filter what you're seeing and hearing from the other. A lot of communication is nonverbal through these kind of avenues of not exactly what we say, but how we say it, how we look when we say it, how we sound when we say it, how we're postured when we say it, things like that. So those are going to be things that we return back to, those nonverbals and ways of communicating, skills of communicating that we'll talk about will tie back into that as we go through the next few weeks. So there's a really useful table, table 2.9 in the text that I'd suggest you check out. It's really reasonable to assume that when people who come from different backgrounds, from different cultural environments, different families, approach one another, they have differing communication expectations, kind of different assumptions about how people communicate and what they might mean when they communicate in certain ways. And you will undoubtedly meet people that you have to work with as a professional, like in a colleague setting, or a professional to a child or family member. You'll meet people who you have to decide how to handle the differences in communication expectations that you notice. And in general, in my mind, there's basically two ways of doing that. Kind of complementing their communicational style with your own unique set of expectations. Basically, that means that two people express things differently or embody different communicational styles, but do so in a complementary way. And another way is to alter your own way of communicating to kind of match theirs, a little more of a mirroring kind of effort. And there's a balance of those two approaches that you'll have to explore and figure out on your own for different situations what's best. There's a risk at moving too far out on either side. If you're only focused on expressing your own style of communication in hopes that it's complementing theirs, and you don't move at all, you only express things the way you always do express them, then the person you're speaking with may feel that they're being met with a kind of rigidity, and that's not going to be helpful to maintain a kind of open communicational style. On the other hand, if you walk into a setting or a scenario and immediately try to match everyone you speak with totally, then you get kind of lost and you're faking a lot, and that's not helpful either because people tend to pick up on that. So being able to balance that complementarity with alteration will be something you'll have to find your own comfort zone with. So another way of kind of putting that is being true to yourself on one hand, but also being responsive and flexible to who the other is in the ways that you communicate. And what I mean is the way you speak, what words you choose, what your nonverbals might be like, how you match or complement the other's nonverbals, and so on. So the next couple of weeks we're going to go through in more detail some more specific skills of communication as they pertain to active listening and maintaining a professional stance. And so I'm hoping that they will be really, really specific things you can practice, and I'm going to ask you to practice them much like we did in the self-awareness module. So we're kind of sliding into skills of communication as opposed to skills of self-awareness. But for this week, I haven't added any assignments to complete other than the community resources reflection that was on the syllabus. So make sure that you follow up with that. And also I've posted a Summative Skills handout. That's basically just all of the specific skills that we're going to cover through the course, including observation, self-awareness, the skills of active listening and responding appropriately and maintaining a professional stance, things that we haven't quite gotten to yet, but that we will soon. So that's that for this week. If you have any trouble keeping up with what's due and when and stuff, just let me know. But I have kind of put some of the due dates out a little later than I originally set them for, just to give you a little time to have that bundle of assignments complete. So note that there's a assignment folder for February, the weeks of February, I think it's 13th and 20th. And I've just uploaded some for this week, the week of the 27th. So all of that's kind of happening at one time, but you do have a little time in the next week or so to get that finished. So reach out to me with any confusion or anything like that, and I'll see you next time we meet.